Al Jazeera Podcasts.
Today, a gang that started inside a Venezuelan prison is now at the center of U.S. immigration policy.
We're learning new details about the Venezuelan gang Tren de Aragua, which President Trump labeled an invading force when he invoked the Alien Enemies Act.
The U.S. says it's going after a violent criminal gang. But is the threat real? And why hasn't anyone heard of them until recently? I'm Natasha Del Toro, and this is The Take. Right now, almost 500,000 Venezuelans in the U.S. have entered a precarious situation. Last week, the U.S. Supreme Court allowed the Trump administration to end temporary protected status for Venezuelans. And that's worrying for many who had that status.
I feel it personally because I belong to those 300,000 who are currently in a sort of limbo, waiting to see what will happen.
In March, around 250 Venezuelans were flown against their will to the most notorious prison in El Salvador.
Secot, El Salvador's maximum security prison, the biggest in the world. It has room for 40,000 people, and it's almost full, 80 to 100 prisoners in each cell, only let out for 30 minutes of exercise a day.
A prison with such harsh conditions that one Salvadorian official says the only way out is in a coffin. These inmates were accused of being part of Tren de Aragua, a gang that the Trump administration has now labeled part of a so-called invasion. In fact, U.S. President Donald Trump invoked a centuries-old law called the Alien Enemies Act to justify their removal. So what is Tren de Aragua really? And is this crackdown truly about a gang or something else? Mike LaSusa and his publication Inside Crime have been reporting on Tren de Aragua.
Organized crime in Latin America has been my specialty.
Very cool, Mike LaSusa. We're very happy to have you here to talk about Tren de Aragua. This is a gang that we've been hearing so much about lately. You know, in Spanish, I thought this was very interesting because I kept hearing Aragua and I didn't understand what that meant, right? But Aragua, so it's train from Aragua. And Aragua is a state in the northwest of Venezuela. Just from the pictures I saw online, it's like a really beautiful place with Caribbean beaches and these like jungles. It's very lush. You know, before the Trump administration, before notorious Salvadorian prisons, you know, why are we hearing so much about this group now?
Well, I think we're hearing a lot about Tren de Aragua in this moment because of what you just said, because of the rhetoric, the political rhetoric around it, particularly from Trump and his allies.
All three savages charged with Jocelyn and Lakin's murders were members of the Venezuelan prison gang, the toughest gang, they say, in the world, known as Tren de Aragua. 2 weeks ago, I officially designated this gang, along with MS-13 and the bloodthirsty Mexican drug cartels, as foreign terrorist organizations. They are now officially in the same category as ISIS, and that's not good for them.
They've really latched onto this gang as a security threat when they've also used the gang's activities and alleged presence in the United States as a justification for their mass deportation campaign.
I mean, it's funny. I worked in Miami for a very long time. I had a lot of friends who were Venezuelan colleagues, and this was never a gang name that had come up, you know. Let's lay out a little bit of the context that we are seeing in Venezuela in case people have forgotten. Over the last decade, there's been a major refugee crisis that's been happening. Venezuelans have been fleeing the country due to political conditions, economic conditions, and they're now sort of spread out across the Americas, Colombia, Peru, Brazil. And in the United States, there's almost 800,000 Venezuelans who've ended up here, according to the Migration Policy Institute. Let's back up a little bit now then and talk about who is Tren de Aragua? How did the gang start? What are they known for?
Sure. Well, Tren de Aragua, as you mentioned, began in the state of Aragua in Venezuela, and really became more powerful as it gained control of a prison in that state. And that prison was known as the Tocoron prison.
Hmm.
The Venezuelan government was having an image problem essentially with its management of its prison system. There were some very significant incidents of violence, some large massacres. So their response to this was to essentially hand control of the prisons over to the prisoners themselves.
Oh.
And that included this Tocoron prison.
Okay.
So, the gang that controlled the prison, the gang members that controlled the prison, adopted this name, Tren de Aragua, and essentially were able to use the prison as both a safe haven and as a captive source of revenue. So they would extort the other prisoners in the prison and use those resources to fund their criminal evolution into a very powerful prison gang within that state.
That's fascinating. I know you had never been in Venezuela, but you have people reporting that are there locally. How has the gang changed over the years?
Yeah, so the biggest step that the gang took in its evolution was to evolve from being a prison gang to having criminal power outside of the prison walls, and not just outside of the prison walls of Tocoron, but also outside of the borders of Venezuela. So Tren de Aragua was the first Venezuelan-born criminal group to actually expand and establish activities outside of Venezuela, and it remains the only one to have done so so far.
So it is a transnational gang. Everything that you've just sort of laid out about Tren de Aragua, what would make them a target for the Trump administration now?
I think there are a lot of things going on there. It's a complicated question. At first, I think Tren de Aragua became a diplomatic problem for the Maduro administration with Venezuela's neighbors in South America. So the gang was able to expand beyond Venezuela's borders, set up shop in countries and cities with huge diaspora communities of Venezuelan migrants. So Santiago de Chile, Bogota, even Medellin now in Colombia, some certain parts of Brazil that are near the Venezuelan border, Peru, the capital, Lima. So the presence of this gang in those countries was creating, security problems. The government was being the governments in those countries were being pressured to do something about that, and they in turn put pressure on the Maduro regime to deal with the problem of Tren de Aragua from within Venezuela. So I think Trump sort of saw the diplomatic pressure that this gang's presence was causing for Maduro from his neighbors and sort of jumped on that bandwagon. And then additionally, once Trump actually assumed office and became president, he had been promising mass deportations throughout his campaign. And I think he seized on this gang and its alleged presence in the United States to form a legal justification for that mass deportation campaign.
Now, you're in Denver, where there is a pretty substantial Venezuelan community. There are Venezuelans that have settled there. Have you seen any evidence of this gang specifically on the ground there?
No. I have not seen it myself. I have spoken to local law enforcement officials who have told me that there is some presence of the gang, or at the very least, there are criminal activities that are taking place that are affiliated with the gang's name. So we're not totally sure, as Insight Crime, whether these alleged members have any real affiliation with the broader international group, but certainly there are crimes that are being attributed to them, and some criminals may be using the gang's name to give more credibility to their extortion threats or to their criminal activities.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the way that it's reported in the media.
What started as a gang of Venezuelan migrants has now evolved into a potent transnational crime force.
Tren de Aragua is a violent prison gang from Venezuela known for robberies, cold-blooded murders, sex trafficking, and prostitution.
And now with the Trump administration, it seems like this is this very scary gang that has tentacles in cities across the United States.
Countless thousands of these terrorists were welcomed into the U.S. by the Biden administration. But now every last one will be rounded up and forcibly removed from our country, or, if they're too dangerous, put in jails, standing trial in this country, because we don't want them to come back ever.
I mean, is there credible evidence that Tren de Aragua is committing crimes in the United States?
Again, I think we have to be careful when we talk about Tren de Aragua as if it's a cohesive organization that has like a leadership structure and some sort of coordinated plans for its activities in the United States. I don't think there's any evidence of that yet. What is certain is that there are people who are committing crimes and who are affiliating themselves or being associated by law enforcement with this gang. But again, it's not clear whether those activities are coordinated in any way among the various alleged cells. It's not clear who, if anyone, is directing the activities of the gang writ large in the United States. So I think when we talk about what is Tren de Aragua doing in the United States, we have to be careful to not talk about it as though it's some sort of cohesive organization.
More with Mike after the break. There have been a lot of statements from the Trump administration about this gang and about these people that Trump is saying that are part of the gang. And so basically what you're telling me is that some of that might not be true based on your reporting. Maybe you could tell us what you found and the disconnect there.
Yeah, what we found is that the criminal activities that are associated with Tren de Aragua or that are blamed on Tren de Aragua here in the United States tend to be criminal activities with a low barrier to entry. So this is stuff that doesn't require a lot of criminal sophistication, basically extortion schemes targeting other vulnerable Venezuelan migrants for the most part. It doesn't take a lot of brains or a lot of sophistication to go and demand money from somebody, and if they don't give it to you, threaten to beat them up or hurt them in some way. Small-scale drug dealing. Again, we haven't seen any evidence of some more sophisticated operations that would involve kind of cross-border transport of drugs in large quantities. It's mostly, again, local retail distribution of those drugs. We've seen some sex trafficking allegations against the gang, and we've also seen small-scale arms trafficking allegations. And again, there's no evidence that any of these activities have been coordinated by some larger leadership structure. So when we talk about a cohesive gang, like for example, the MS-13 would be one example. There's a leadership structure, and the lower levels of that organization respond to the leadership structure. They take orders from the leadership structure. They may kick a percentage of their profits up the chain, and we haven't seen anything that alleges that the supposed Tren de Aragua members in the United States are acting in that way.
So why would they be calling themselves Tren de Aragua then?
Well, the gang has a very significant reputation throughout South America and now within the United States and internationally for being violent, for being powerful, and for somebody who wants to extort someone and wants to bring some more credibility to that threat. They may associate themselves with a bigger, powerful group like Tren de Aragua. That may also be a way of scaring off rivals and just generally sounding scarier and more powerful than you may be.
And so what do we know about the people who are members of Tren de Aragua? How do you identify them? Again, like the law enforcement has supposedly identified some, which may or may not be true, but what are their kind of identifying features?
Yeah, that's a great question. Tren de Aragua does not, as far as we know, use symbols like tattoos or clothes or colors to identify its members. So in that sense, it can be somewhat difficult because there aren't these obvious visual markers of membership. At the same time, there are ways that you can determine someone's membership in the gang, particularly if there are documented records of their direct ties to known leaders of the gang. For example, the leaders that were running the gang from Tocoron prison. Things like text messages, prison records, those sorts of things can be helpful in identifying actual members.
But isn't this one of the reasons the government used to round up some of these members and deport them to this, El Salvadorian prison, that they said that they had these tattoos? I mean, you're telling me now that tattoos aren't part of, one of the identifying features.
Yeah, it is one of the criteria that was used to identify alleged members of Tren de Aragua for deportation. We just don't have any evidence that suggests that that's an accurate means of identification. So I couldn't tell you why they chose that.
Huh. Okay, that's very interesting. And I know one of the other points recently, there was a declassified memo by the government, by intelligence agencies, saying that they suspect that this gang is not being directed by Venezuelan President Maduro. Why is that? Why is that significant here?
So I'll preface this by saying I'm not a lawyer, but
Yes.
basically, the Trump administration has invoked a law known as the Alien Enemies Act, which gives the president powers to rapidly deport people that are alleged to be part of an invading force. And so the allegation that the Trump administration made is that Maduro is directing Tren de Aragua to invade the United States. And so the president has the authority to remove alleged members of Tren de Aragua as members of that invading force. So that's the legal justification. It is notable that Trump's own intelligence community seems to have concluded that that is not the case, that Maduro is not directing the activities of this gang, and that conclusion matches our own conclusion at Insight Crime and that of other researchers of this gang.
I mean, he used that as a justification when he invoked this act, right? I mean, that's one of the reasons why he invoked the Aliens Enemies Act, saying that this gang was somehow being directed by the Venezuelan government. So, and you're saying that this justification actually doesn't really hold up.
Yeah, I mean, again, that's not just our conclusion. It's the conclusion of other independent researchers. And from what we know from the reporting of the New York Times and others, that's also the conclusion of Trump's own intelligence community.
Huh. I mean, and from what you know, is this gang, is it growing in power? Or like, what's the status from what you all have been able to ascertain?
So the difficulty of identifying alleged members of the gang makes it really difficult for us to determine the size and scale of the gang and whether it's growing or shrinking. What I will say is that the diplomatic pressure that Maduro's neighbors put on him to do something about this resulted in the Venezuelan government mounting a raid on the Tocoron prison, which was the headquarters of Tren de Aragua. And that raid dispersed the leadership of the gang from its headquarters, really kind of disrupted the gang's hierarchy and the leadership. Venezuela's worked with its neighbors, particularly Colombia, to arrest some of the leaders that escaped essentially from the prison or that were on the lam prior to that, and was able to get these guys essentially off the street. So the gang has really suffered, and it appears that it is drifting more towards a place where the Tren de Aragua name is more of a brand than anything else, right? The groups that are operating under that umbrella are more like franchises, and they're not necessarily taking orders from the hierarchical leadership structure like they were before.
Gotcha. During the first Trump administration, I actually reported on how Trump was detaining and deporting teens, many of them who were unaccompanied minors. And he was accusing them of being a part of MS-13, Mara Salvatrucha, the gang from El Salvador, though it was found that many of them, there was very little evidence, and as a result, the ACLU sued the government. Now, we reported on this podcast that some of the detainees were accused of being Tren de Aragua, but also had no criminal record. So, I mean, do you see a pattern here?
I think there is a parallel between the way that the first Trump administration treated the MS-13 threat and the way that they have treated the Tren de Aragua issue. I think the major difference that's important for people to know between those two situations is that the MS-13 was actually a threat to the United States in a much more significant way than Tren de Aragua is. That was a gang that in fact, was born in the United States, right. though it grew in power in Central America. It was born in the United States. It's always been here, and it has deep roots in many communities across the country. Tren de Aragua is a different animal in the sense that it's, if anything, it's a very recent arrival to the United States. Doesn't have very deep ties. It doesn't appear to be posing a large security threat to the general public.
If it's not posing such a national security threat, as you say, why is there such an intense focus then on this group? I mean, do think that they are just being used then as an excuse to kind of mass deport, large groups of Venezuelans?
I mean, the Trump administration has said as much, right? Invoking the Alien Enemies Act and naming this gang. So certainly that is their justification for the mass deportation campaign.
And at the same time, like, let's talk about another thing that's happening. Life has become even more uncertain for hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans living in the United States. Yeah, I just think of some of the accounts like we've seen in the media. There was a hairdresser that was deported that was accused of being part of this gang. There was a food delivery driver. There was a soccer player, just like, kind of people in this country who may not have had anything to do with gangs and who the Trump administration is labeling as Tren de Aragua. Do we need to be as afraid of Tren de Aragua as the Trump administration or, again, some media outlets are sort of portraying?
I think that is an individual decision. If you're a Venezuelan migrant who is living in one of these vulnerable communities in a vulnerable situation, then you may need to have a bit more caution about this gang than if you're somebody like me who is not in that situation and has the protection of being a semi-public figure. So I think it really is an individual decision.
So the people then that are probably going to be most affected by this gang, you're saying, would be the Venezuelan migrants themselves.
Exactly. The threat is primarily to vulnerable Venezuelan migrant communities. Those are the people that have been victimized by people associated with this gang in the past. That's the pattern that we see. And so I think those are the communities where this is a bigger threat than really anywhere else.
That's important. I mean, these are also the people who are now, terrified of being deported, who are some of them self-deporting back to a country where there's a humanitarian crisis, there's an economic crisis, there's a political crisis.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Trump administration would like it. Would be politically expedient for them if large portions of the general American public were afraid of this gang, but I don't think that there's much reason for that fear to exist.
And that's The Take. If you want to catch more episodes like this, make sure you're following our YouTube playlist. That's where you'll find all of our recent content updated regularly so you never miss an episode. And while you're at it, hit that subscribe button so that you stay in the loop with all things Al Jazeera English. See you tomorrow.